Now, if I'm using the chest press to take my chest musculature to the point of task failure, and I'm compensating with my neck, that is not true volitional failure. That is the point of loss of form. It's the point of compensation. Hello and welcome back. Exciting times. We are at episode 25 of the Smart Strength Training podcast. And we're going to circle straight back into strength training advice and the question around, should you train to failure? This topic, sort of proximity to failure and training to failure, I would say is certainly top 3 of the research topics that's come out over the last couple of years. I see a lot of posts on social media about it. And if I'm being really blunt, I see a lot of trainers pump out the usual generic advice that I think massively misses the bigger picture. So I want to come at this from a slightly different angle to make it more usable than the generic. So what is the generic advice first? So the generic advice is that for strength gains, you do not need to train to failure. But for building muscle, the research is more mixed. Maybe you can train to failure, maybe you shouldn't train to failure. So let's delve deeper and add a bit of nuance to this. So as I said, the recent research shows that for strength gains, you do not need to go to failure. You just need to progress the load in which you lift. Now that should be pretty logical. If you want to get stronger, you need to increase the load. And what I want you to think about when it comes to strength and the quality of strength is it's all about the ability to be optimally positioned to produce force in that particular lift. Now, this is true for almost any lift or any type of training, but it's very, very true in the context of strength training. So when I want you to think about strength training, I want you to think about low rep, high load training. I appreciate that strength training potentially is this umbrella term where everything is dumped underneath it, but really thinking of strength training as something very, very heavy that you're only going to lift for a few repetitions. If you've ever watched on TV strongman training or strongman events, you might be familiar with the Atlas stones. So these are just enormous, great big concrete round balls that the competitors have to pick up and put onto a surface. And you'll notice that the lifter will really contort themselves into a particular position. Their spine will not be the sort of stereotypical, quote unquote, neutral, but it will be the most optimal position for that specific exercise to lift that weight. And that principle of specificity is super important when we're thinking about strength training being using a lot of external load, because when you're using a high amount of external load, you've got much less wiggle room when it comes to your ability to do the exercise. Recognizing, let's take it into the gym and context of an exercise that you're more familiar with. Something like a squat, for example. If you're doing a very heavy 1 rep max squat and you're getting close to failure, what might happen? You might compensate. So you might shift your weight into your right hip. You might shift your weight forward and move more into the forefoot. This then becomes a less efficient way to do the exercise. So going to the point of failure is going to mean that you're much more likely to move into poor movements. You're going to compensate and you're not going to be as efficient at what you do. And of course, under high load, you're going to have a higher risk of injury. So we should definitely recognize that for strength training, it's very logical that we do not want to go to failure. It's very, very task efficiency focused. But now let's talk about the research into hypertrophy, building muscle, and potentially why is that research a bit more mixed? Because some studies show that training to failure could be advantageous, whereas other research shows that steering clear of failure also could be. And that actually is very logical to be why it's so mixed. So just as a general pointer, before I go any further on the nuance, I actually think it's smart to steer clear from failure. And that should come quite apparent why as I go through this next part. So let's make sure we understand the clear difference between what hypertrophy training is about that's specifically different to strength training. So for hypertrophy, you're trying to take the muscle fiber, specifically the contractile elements of the muscle fiber, to the point of something called volitional failure. So the point in which you are physically unable to complete another rep and you either stop moving or you drop the weight. So what's really happening in that moment in time is that you're trying to contract against that external load, but the fiber is unable to produce enough force. Now that could be due to maybe energy depletion in the muscle. It could be due to a buildup of substrates, metabolites in the bloodstream, or more likely it's going to be down to the fact that your body is unable to recruit enough muscle fibers to continue to do repetitions. And at that moment in time, a high level of mechanical tension on the muscle is sensed, and then failure will occur. However, training or optimally taking an exercise for the goal of hypertrophy, building muscle, to the point of failure requires a high level of skill. Now, the same is true of strength training, and why it's really important for hypertrophy is because what you want to do is standardize, and I'll use that word loads over the next sort of 10 minutes, standardize the reps. So the first rep to the last rep almost look completely identical. So if you're doing like a dumbbell chest press, you're able to go all the way down to the bottom, all the way up to the top. The first rep to the last rep should look the same without compensation. So what could be classic compensations for a dumbbell chest press? Well, my elbows could start to flare. I could shrug my shoulders. My neck might start to elevate, and the movement pattern itself is breaking down. Now, if I'm using the chest press to take my chest musculature to the point of task failure, and I'm compensating with my neck, that is not true volitional failure. That is the point of loss of form. It's the point of compensation. A skilled lifter, if you watch them take their set to failure, it will look almost completely identical. The only thing that might slightly change is maybe a slight reduction in the overall range of motion. Maybe on that chest press, they're unable to fully lock out their elbows at the top. And you should notice a reduction in movement speed as they're struggling to maintain that high level of force production against the load. But the pathway, the movement pathway itself, should be very, very specific and stay very consistent and constant throughout. So if you have the ability to standardize your range of motion, your technique, and your control of the exercise, then you likely have the skill to take that exercise to the point of going all the way to failure. But developing that level of skill takes time, it takes practice, and it takes progression over time. So I think it's more logical just to focus on gradual progression, because if you're gradually progressing your exercise, you're practicing the repetitions over and over again at the same movement, you're getting better at the task. You will get to the point by default that you'll be eventually training pretty close to the point of failure. But if you shortcut that and you try to go to failure and you're compensating all over the place, yes, you're going to the point of not being able to do the exercise. But when we're talking about failure in training for the goal of hypertrophy, that is massively missing the mark. And that's what I don't like about this general advice, is that telling people to go to failure or not go to failure might just end up with a lot of really sloppy looking work. So to be honest, if you don't have that ability to standardize what you're doing, train through full range of motion at a particular exercise, there's no real need for you even to really think about, should I or should I not be training to failure? We want to make sure that form is the thing that you're really dialed into. This is where having a video to watch back what you're doing can be really, really smart. Making sure you're switched on to the exercise. That's not like mind-muscle connection switched on. That's like, don't have your phone in your hand thinking about work when you go to start that dumbbell chest press. Clear your mind. Do not let your mind wander. Standardize your focus to try and standardize that movement. Because if you're losing form, then the conversation around training to failure kind of is irrelevant. We want to sort of tap back into what's more important in this moment in time. It's going to be that technique that's more important. Next up, I think it's really worthwhile talking about that some exercises by default just do not lend themselves well to going to point of failure. Let's talk about the squat, the barbell back squat, and the bench press, the barbell bench press. If you were to go to complete failure in a squat, that would mean you would be unable to get out at the bottom of the squat. And the same as true the bench press, you'd go to push and you would not be able to do it. So you'd get pinned under the bar on a bench press and you would end up having to dump the bar at the bottom of the squat. And that's clearly not a smart move to do. It might happen at some point across your training journey, but it certainly shouldn't happen week in, week out with the exercise. So just thinking about some exercises as far as setup is concerned, just don't lend themselves well to actually going to the point of failure. Some exercises you can simply drop the bar. A barbell RDL or a deadlift, you can of course just drop the bar. But of course with the RDL and the deadlift, that load goes directly through your spine. The weight is in your hands, you transfer that weight through the shoulder girdle, down the spine into the hips, and the hips are the prime movers. So in that situation, what's more likely to go to the point of failure? What's going to give out first? Is it your hamstrings and glutes, or is it more likely to stabilize around your lower back? Probably the latter. So do you want to take an RDL and a deadlift all the way to the point of failure? I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying for the majority of people, it probably shouldn't be done. So when we think about training to failure, we want to really think about the tasks that we're doing. We don't want to have exercises that carry a high risk. So this actually might be more machine-based exercises, maybe more upper body-based exercises where it's a little bit less skill. And if I can't finish my rep on a dumbbell chest press, I can just drop the dumbbells down by the side. If I'm looking around a gym floor and I think of something like a split squat, do I see many people take split squats to the point I think they're at failure? No, definitely not. Like that exercise requires a really high level of skill and it's brutal, mentally very taxing to do it. So in that sense, well, we definitely want to be thinking about the technique, the movement, the control of the movement, that standardization. I told you I'd say that word over and over again, and then just progression over time. And then by default, as you do that month after month, year after year, you'll get to the point, you'll be pretty close to the point of failure. But a really great place to start to experience what it feels like to actually train to failure is going to be something like a bicep curl, or a machine-based isolation exercise like a leg extension or a hamstring curl, making sure you haven't got knee pain, of course, because the machine itself does help to standardize what you do. Obviously, there's still a level of understanding of the exercise, but that's a really nice place to start to feel what it's like to go all the way to that point of failure. And then if there's any exercise that you personally feel like you have a really high level of skill at because you've done it so many times over and over and over and over again, then that also might be a good place to start to train that a little bit close to failure. That could be like a dumbbell chest press or maybe a machine chest press, maybe like a chest supported row, something like that. But again, just locking in that form. So to wrap up and to summarize, as far as the research is concerned, for strength, we do not want to train to failure, recognizing when we say strength, we're talking about low rep, high load training, and the risk to reward ratio of going to failure there is high, and loss of form means a lack of movement efficiency. When it comes to hypertrophy, the research is more mixed, and hopefully that starts to become quite clear why. Because there's more variables when it comes to training to failure. And if I'm trying to take a muscle tissue to the point of failure, I want that form to be locked in, but I want the form to be locked in very much to keep the tension on the target muscle, whereas for strength training, it's more about movement efficiency. So for both of them, or for more so for strength training, load's going to be the thing you're thinking about. For hypertrophy, both load and volume progressing over time. That's where you dial your mindset in. Now recognize, of course, that there's this task-specific element. Some exercises that are machine-based, fine, you can definitely start to build in some training to failure there. But some exercises are just not worth going to failure. And I would say it's true probably ever. Outside of competitive powerlifters, I don't think things like squat, bench, and deadlift really need to be taken to the point of failure by general populations, because moving well, not being injured is a very, very important thing for us all. So making sure that we aren't being daft and allowing ego to come into the weights room and then eventually or effectively potentially cause a risk of injury. To wrap up, if I am being really brutally honest, like I train in different parts of the world, in different gyms quite regularly, I definitely don't see enough people pushing their sets to the point of failure. So I do think the question around should we be training to failure, I think for a lot of people, it's more about actually it is important to make sure you're training hard enough. I see too many people maybe because the fear is from this, or my thought for what I've just said is I might terrify people that already aren't training hard enough to back off even further because I've mentioned sort of injury throughout this. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at really is just being really, really precise with your movements to make sure that you understand what training to failure really feels like. But if I'm looking around a weights room, I actually want more people to push harder, but I want more people to dial into the technique as they're doing it. And 2 podcasts ago, I spoke about this idea of mixing up workouts. One of the reasons I mentioned it on that podcast, I don't like people mixing up their workouts is you lose the ability to practice and exercise. You lose the ability to standardize what you do. So a lot of these things that I talk about, they all have a sort of a link into another part of the conversation. So another good reason not to constantly vary your workouts is exercise standardization and skill practice. So hopefully that was useful. Hopefully that also just puts your mind into where you need to focus. Your focus really should be on progressive overload. It should be on task-specific skill practice. And then 100% you will be and you should be getting to the point that you are able to take your exercise to failure. That honestly takes years, not weeks. You might think you're good at an exercise, but watch what happens when you take that exercise all the way to the last set. One of the things that I always like to ask clients to do, new clients always like to send me really pretty videos of them doing a really good exercise, usually the first set. I always then say, I want to see the last set. I want to see what happens on your last 1 to 3 reps of your final set. I can see from there, do I think you're close enough to failure? What's your movement pattern look like when you're at that position? And that is gold information for a trainer because that's way more important than sort of like a perfect warm-up set is ever going to be. So I hope that was useful and you can put that into practice in your own workouts.